haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
The stars had begun to die before anyone noticed. They dimmed slowly, one by one, across the firmament, their light bending through the warp like faint memories slipping away. In the heart of the Imperium, the golden throne shuddered with each pulse of that dying light. The Emperor of mankind sat motionless upon it, neither alive nor dead, his body sustained by machines older than empires, his spirit cast adrift into the sea of souls. The galaxy worshipped his silence, mistaking stillness for divinity, but within that radiant corpse, a whisper stirred, a voice not entirely his own. It called to him from the black ocean of the warp, where time had no mercy and memory had a pulse. "We truly love you," he thought, the faint echo of humanity rising in his mind like a prayer half remembered. "We care for you more than you know. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started." He saw the galaxy as it was, not as mortals saw it. A map of pain carved across eternity. Worlds once green now burned to ash. Fleets that had once carried his dream scattered like bones through the void. Even the Astronomicon, the great beacon of his will, flickered like a dying candle, its light no longer constant but trembling. The Emperor watched from within himself, trapped in a labyrinth made from his own thoughts. In that endless darkness, there were no walls, only corridors of memory that turned upon themselves until he could not tell the beginning from the end. He walked among them, as he once had walked among men, tall and silent, the air thick with the scent of ozone and grief. Every step revealed a face, warriors who had died in his name, cities that had burned for his cause, suns who had risen and fallen like comets. They came and went like waves, each whispering a single word: why? The word followed him through the corridors, soft at first, then louder, until it became a chorus. He turned toward it, and the warp opened around him like a wound. A figure stepped forth, woven from gold and shadow, its eyes the colour of dying suns. It wore his face, but younger, unscarred, unburdened. "You built a throne of bones," it said. "You forged eternity, but forgot to ask what it costs." The Emperor stared into that mirrored reflection and saw not an enemy, but the weight of his own choices. "Who are you?" he asked, though he already knew. The figure smiled, a smile that belonged to no god, only a man. "I am the truth you buried beneath the light." Then the warp folded in upon itself, and the memory vanished. He awoke within the throne room, or something that resembled it. Though in the warp, reality was only what one dared to believe. Pillars of light stretched upward into infinity, each one humming with the voices of those who prayed to him. Their faith bound him, a billion chains of devotion feeding his existence. Every plea for mercy, every cry of faith, every hymn uttered in darkness reached him as light turned to fire. He should have felt gratitude, but instead he felt suffocation. They had built him into a prison. Humanity had entombed its savior. He could not die because they would not let him. He could not awaken because they feared what awakening meant. The Emperor, the unyielding, the master of mankind. A god in everything but freedom. Far across the galaxy, entire systems tore themselves apart in his name. Ecclesiarchs crowned themselves prophets. The Adeptus Mechanicus whispered of his divinity while gutting his principles. Even the Custodies, his eternal guards, stood unmoving, uncertain whether they protected their emperor or his corpse. Yet within him burned something ancient, not hope, not power, but defiance. The old will that had once united terror stirred again. He would not let his empire die ignorant of what it had become. He would find himself in the abyss. He looked down upon his hands, though they were no longer flesh. They shimmered with radiant decay, particles of golden dust drifting away into the air. He wondered how long he had been unraveling. Time meant nothing in the warp. 10,000 years could pass in the span of a breath. He remembered his final battle, the wound Horus had given him, the choice to sacrifice himself to save mankind. But the memory bled into something else. Not victory, not sacrifice, but hesitation. There had been a moment, a single heartbeat, where he saw love in his son's eyes. He had killed it anyway. That moment replayed endlessly, each time more unbearable. Horus's dying whisper haunted him. You wanted to be a god. Now see what gods become. The warp trembled as he remembered. Shapes moved in the distance. Things without form, memories of demons that once feared him. They watched from the edges of thought, tasting his weakness. He could feel them gathering, feeding on his introspection. For 10 millennia, they had waited for this. The Emperor steadied himself, summoning light that burned through the spectral dark. The demons recoiled, but their laughter echoed, for they knew he was not whole. Every fragment of self-doubt gave them strength. Every flicker of remorse opened another crack in his armor. The Emperor of mankind, once the mightiest of all psychic beings, now fought a war, not of armies, but of memories. He wandered deeper into the labyrinth of his mind, searching for the source of the first whisper. The corridors became colder, the air vibrating with something alive. He realized with dread that this was not his memory. It was something new, something growing. The warp had learned from him. It had taken his image, his ideals, his light, and turned them into something that thought. He saw visions of worshippers across the galaxy, billions bowing to golden statues, burning heretics, singing hymns to his glory. Every act of devotion fed the thing that watched him now. He had tried to destroy gods, and in doing so, he had birthed the greatest of them all, himself. He fell to his knees, surrounded by echoes of his own sanctity. He wanted to scream, but remembered that gods do not beg. Still, he whispered a truth into the void. I am not your God. I never was. The stars in his vision flickered as if startled by confession. Somewhere far beyond time, a pilgrim praying before his image faltered mid-sentence, unsure why. The Emperor's whisper travelled like a fracture through belief, too faint to be noticed, too real to be erased. And within that tremor, something ancient awoke, not hatred, but longing. For all his power, all his perfection, he had never known what it was to be forgiven. In the endless dark, a faint light moved toward him, small, trembling, human. A child's voice spoke from within the glow, saying only, "You tried." The Emperor reached for it, but the light slipped through his fingers like dust. He sat in silence, surrounded by the sound of dying stars. The war within had only begun, and already he understood its cruelty. To fight oneself is to bleed forever. And so he rose, luminous and broken, and walked once more into the heart of his own soul, where even gods must learn what it means to be alone. The warp breathed like a living sea, slow and terrible, and the Emperor drifted upon it, like a thought unmoored from reality. The light that once defined him flickered with unease, forming constellations that collapsed before his eyes. Here, memory and dream shared the same tongue. He walked upon the surface of shifting time and saw terror as it had been, green and unsullied, a world not yet broken by empire or faith. He stood among the ruins of his first dream, hearing the laughter of a species that no longer existed, his own humanity dissolving into the static of history. He touched the soil and felt the heartbeat of mankind as it was before him, fragile, desperate, reaching for stars it could never hold. The warp trembled with its echo, and he felt the loneliness of creation, the burden of being both father and jailer to all that would ever live in his shadow. The visions came softly, like the whisper of sand over glass. A boy with eyes of fire building a city from the dust of conquest. A scholar weeping over forbidden truths. A warrior lifting his blade beneath a sun that would never set. These were fragments of himself, scattered through the centuries before he became the emperor, before humanity dared to worship the idea of perfection. He remembered the wars fought in silence, the pacts made in blood, the tears he never allowed himself to shed. Every face, every choice, every triumph came back to him now, not as glory, but as accusation. He had lived too long to distinguish salvation from sin. The warp, ever hungry, mirrored his uncertainty. It took the shape of his thoughts, building worlds out of guilt, monuments from regret. Through the storm of memory, figures began to form, shapes half known, faces both beloved and damned, his sons. They approached through mist that tasted of iron and prayer, each bearing the mark of his design. Horus came first, eyes filled with the same fire that had once lit the galaxy. "Father," he said, voice heavy with the echo of betrayal, "do you still dream of unity?" The emperor wanted to speak, but the word died in his throat. Behind Horus, Magnus watched in silence, the light of his mind flickering like a broken star. Sanguinius appeared next, wings folded in sorrow, his expression the quiet forgiveness of one who understood too much. They stood before him not as enemies, but as memories, each carrying a truth he had long buried. Horus stepped closer, his armor cracked and smoking, his gaze burning with questions the emperor had no courage to answer. "You made us gods," he whispered, "then punished us for believing it." Magnus lowered his head, the glow of his third eye dimming. "You taught me to seek knowledge," he murmured, "and condemn me when I found it." Sanguinius looked upon them both and spoke not in anger, but in mourning. "We were your hands," he said, "and you cut them from your own body." The emperor stood in silence, the weight of their words heavier than any battle fought in the physical realm. For centuries, he had justified their suffering as necessity, but here, where truth bled into being, he could not lie to himself. The warp shimmered, rippling like water under unseen wind. From its depths rose new visions, entire legions burning, worlds consumed by fire, temples raised in his name upon bones. The faces of humanity appeared in the waves, soldiers dying beneath banners of gold, priests crying for mercy, children born beneath the shadow of his statues. They reached for him, hands pale with devotion, voices pleading for salvation. Each cry pierced him like a blade. He had promised them peace, yet all he had given was order, and order had become another form of death. The warp fed on that contradiction, turning faith into flame, love into hunger. He turned away, but the images followed. He saw himself upon the throne, vast and unmoving, a god sculpted from agony. He saw the cults, the heresies, the blood spilled for his image. He saw the black ships, laden with psychers who screamed his name as they were sacrificed to sustain his light. He saw humanity kneel before an empty idea, and he understood that his empire survived not through strength, but through fear. He had built a cage, and called it civilization. Every prayer that reached him now carried the taste of despair. The Emperor closed his eyes, and in that moment, the warp grew silent, listening. From the quiet came another presence, not demon, not memory, but something impossibly familiar. It spoke with his own voice, yet softer, weary. You sought perfection in a world that was never meant to hold it. The Emperor turned, and there stood a figure cloaked in pale fire. It had his eyes, his bearing, but none of his certainty. "Who are you?" he asked, though the answer trembled in his heart. The figure smiled gently. "I am the dream that bled into flesh, the vision that outlived its creator. You wanted to end gods, yet you made yourself into one." The Emperor stepped forward, and the warp rippled between them like glass about to break. "If you are me," he said, "then why do you accuse me?" The reflection tilted its head. "Because you forgot that even gods must answer to what they create." The Emperor reached out, and the figure dissolved into a storm of light. In its place rose a new horizon, a city of gold built upon an ocean of screams. Every spire pulsed with human faith, every street sang with hymns twisted by time. The warp reshaped itself around the vision, showing him the Imperium as seen from beyond reality. It was magnificent and monstrous, a cathedral of cruelty sustained by belief. He walked its streets unseen, feeling the pulse of 1,000,000,000 lives beating in rhythm with his own heart. A mother prayed for her dying child. A soldier begged forgiveness for killing in his name. A priest burned a heretic to keep the flame of faith alive. The Emperor felt each moment, each agony, as though it were his own. This was his legacy, not unity, not enlightenment, but worship without understanding. He fell to his knees at the center of that golden city, the ground beneath him alive with the murmur of endless devotion. The air shimmered with the weight of belief, thick and suffocating. He whispered to the unseen sky, "I never wanted this." The warp answered with laughter that was not cruel, but pitying. The city trembled, its towers bending toward him as if to listen. "Then what did you want?" it asked. He searched for an answer and found none. Perhaps he had never known. He had spoken of mankind's destiny, of reason, of unity. But beneath those words had always been a silence he dared not name. The fear that without him, humanity would be nothing. That fear had built an empire of gods. As the vision faded, he stood once more in the endless dark, surrounded by the remnants of his past. The laughter still lingered, but so too did something else. The faint echo of hope. The Emperor raised his gaze to the distant light of dying stars and felt the weight of eternity pressing against him. The dream that bled into flesh still breathed, and it would not let him rest. He walked onward deeper into the warp, chasing a truth that might unmake him, knowing that to find redemption, he must first remember what it meant to be human. In the depths of the warp, where thoughts grew teeth and faith became flesh, a new light began to burn, a light that was not his own. It flickered at first, uncertain, like a reflection cast upon the surface of oil. Then it steadied, golden and false, filling the horizon with the radiance of imitation. The Emperor stood before it and felt the air vibrate with worship. He heard the endless tide of voices, billions upon billions praying to a god they believed him to be. Every syllable carried across reality like a wave of molten devotion, each word a chain that bound him tighter to the illusion. The light pulsed in answer, growing brighter with every plea, until it no longer illuminated but consumed. In that moment, he understood that his empire no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Faith, and Faith had made a monster. The figure emerged from the brilliance, tall and terrible, clothed in gold that burned like dying suns. It moved with the grace of divinity, but its eyes were hollow, reflecting galaxies swallowed whole. When it spoke, the voice was his, yet magnified beyond recognition, filled with the arrogance of eternity. "I am what they believe you to be," it said. "I am perfection made manifest, the dream that will not die." The Emperor stared into the blinding glow and felt his strength falter. "You are nothing but a shadow," he replied, "a lie built from ignorance." The figure's laughter rippled through the void like thunder over a dead sea. "And yet," it whispered, "I am stronger than truth." Around them, the warp trembled as if in agreement. He tried to reach for power, summoning the raw essence of his will, but the light smothered it. Every thought of rebellion, every attempt at defiance was swallowed by the prayers of mortals. He could feel their minds like countless insects crawling across his consciousness, each one feeding the false sun that towered before him. Temples burned incense in his name. Wars were fought for his glory. Children died whispering his title. The devotion of 10,000 years had given this illusion substance, and it stood now as the most terrible god the galaxy had ever birthed. The Emperor stepped forward, but the radiance seared his essence. His own legend had become his cage, and the bars were made of love. He turned his gaze outward and saw through the eyes of his believers. Planets knelt beneath cathedrals that touched the sky. Fleets sailed beneath banners embroidered with his visage. The Imperium thrived in obedience but rotted in purpose. Every act of faith strengthened the false sun, feeding its core with the endless hunger of belief. The Emperor's name was spoken not as truth but as spell, and each utterance fed the growing storm that consumed him. He had once sought to free mankind from the tyranny of gods, but now he was the greatest god of all. In the reflection of the golden figure, he saw himself enthroned forever, unmoving, immortal, adored, and utterly dead. He called upon the fragments of his memory, searching for the echo of what he once was. In a forgotten corner of his mind, he saw the laboratories of old terror, the golden age before conquest. He saw his scholars, his warriors, his dreamers, men and women who followed him not for faith, but for reason. They had believed in humanity, not divinity. They had believed that enlightenment would end the darkness, but reason had no temples, and enlightenment had no hymns. When war came, it was faith that survived. He felt their loss like the cracking of bone. Each broken ideal became a star collapsing within him. The false sun's light grew stronger as his memories dimmed, feeding upon the erosion of self. The Emperor spoke, his voice trembling with the gravity of aeons. "You feed on their ignorance. You thrive because they cannot see." The figure smiled, radiant and cruel. "I thrive because they must believe. Without me, they are nothing. Without their devotion, you would fade." It reached out, touching his face with hands of pure flame. "We are bound, you and I, the god and the man, the lie and the maker." The Emperor recoiled, but the contact burned through thought and spirit alike. For an instant, he felt everything, the prayers, the suffering, the ecstasy of the faithful, and he saw the truth in its words. The Imperium would collapse without faith. Humanity needed illusion more than it ever needed truth. To destroy the lie would be to destroy mankind itself. He fell to his knees, the void rippling around him like water disturbed by grief. The figure towered above, haloed in light that bent the horizon. Its presence was intoxicating, overwhelming. It was the dream of order, of safety, of destiny fulfilled. It was everything he had once promised, stripped of doubt. The Emperor closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat, he envied it. What would it be like to be worshipped without question? To be perfect, unflawed, eternal? The thought came unbidden and frightened him. The full sun leaned close, whispering with infinite tenderness, "You could join me. Together we would rule as one. No more struggle, no more guilt, only peace through belief." For a moment, he wavered. The galaxy glowed beneath that promise. Trillions of souls unified in blind harmony, every fear erased, every choice made for them. It was a vision so beautiful it broke his heart. Then he saw the silence beneath it, the stillness that was not peace but extinction. The humanity he had fought to preserve would vanish beneath that perfection. He rose slowly, his form flickering, his light dim but defiant. "Peace without will is death," he said. The full sun frowned, and its light grew harsh, cold. "Then you choose suffering." The Emperor met its gaze. "I choose freedom." The golden figure's radiance shuddered, and cracks of shadow spidered through its form. The prayers of billions wailed in protest. Temples quaked, icons shattered. The warp screamed as belief and denial collided. The Emperor drew upon what remained of his strength, summoning light not from divinity but from memory, the light of a human heart that still remembered the warmth of the sun, the laughter of his people, the sound of rain upon stone. That light was small, fragile, mortal, and it burned the full sun like fire against paper. The figure staggered, its voice a roar of collapsing faith. "They will forget you," it hissed. "Without me, you are nothing." The Emperor stepped closer, his eyes filled with the quiet certainty of truth. "Then let them forget." The explosion was silent. The warp folded inward, swallowing light and sound. When the storm cleared, the full sun was gone, its brilliance dispersed into fragments of dying prayer. The Emperor stood alone in the void, his body trembling, his spirit scarred. He felt weaker than before, diminished by victory. The cost was immense, his connection to humanity fading, the golden link of devotion severed. Yet in that loss there was a strange peace. The silence that followed was not empty but pure. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, the quiet hum of existence unshackled from worship. For the first time in millennia, he felt the faint pulse of something forgotten. It was not power. It was not glory. It was the echo of his own humanity whispering in the darkness, reminding him of who he had been before gods were born. The silence that followed the fall of the full sun was unlike any silence he had ever known. It was deep, absolute, a stillness so complete it seemed to hum. The Emperor drifted within it, suspended between thought and nothingness, watching the faint remnants of shattered belief spiral into oblivion, like golden embers lost to the wind. The warp was quieter now, yet not calm. It listened, waiting to see what would emerge from the ruins of faith. He felt its attention upon him, vast and endless, the gaze of something too ancient to comprehend. He no longer burned with divine light, no longer towered like a god in radiant judgment. He was smaller now, dimmed, finite, human in a way that frightened and comforted him. For the first time in millennia, he felt the pulse of his own heartbeat, a slow echo that reminded him that existence, even eternal, was still fragile. He looked upon the remnants of the empire he had once ruled and saw the ripples of his defiance spreading across the stars. The Astronomicon faltered, its light weakening as faith wavered. Pilgrims knelt before empty shrines, whispering prayers into the void. On distant worlds, Saints and prophets dreamed of his absence, and their dreams became prophecy. The golden cathedrals that had once sung his name trembled, as though unsure what God they served. Yet amid that uncertainty, there was something honest, something raw. Without the weight of perfect belief, humanity trembled, but it breathed. The emperor felt the breath of countless lives, unfiltered by worship, uncertain but real. That frailty was beautiful. It was what he had forgotten in his pursuit of immortality. He drifted deeper into the warp, seeking the voices that had once guided him. He expected the demons, the echoes of chaos, the laughter of old enemies. But what came instead was music, faint at first, then swelling, harmonic and terrible. It was not the sound of creation but of memory, the cries of the dead rising like a symphony of regret. He followed the sound through corridors of shadow that shifted with every step. Faces bloomed in the dark, made of smoke and sorrow. They were familiar, each one a life he had touched, a soul lost in the wars he had commanded. A soldier who died whispering his name, a scientist burned for heresy, a child who had prayed for mercy and received silence. They sang to him, not in accusation, but in remembrance, and each note pierced him with unbearable tenderness. As he moved through the choir of the dead, he began to understand the truth that the false son had hidden from him. Divinity had made him deaf. For 10,000 years, he had been too great to hear the small voices, too perfect to feel the quiet grief of those who followed him. Every prayer that had once sustained him now returned as echo, stripped of illusion. He could hear the true sound of his imperium, the weeping of the forgotten, the rage of the betrayed, the quiet endurance of those who still believed despite everything. It was a symphony of contradiction, beautiful and broken. The emperor fell to his knees, and the music swelled, surrounding him like a storm made of souls. Among the countless voices, one rose above the rest, a soft tone trembling but pure. He turned toward it and saw a figure standing in the void, clothed not in gold but in shadow. It was a woman, her eyes wide and sorrowful, her face both ancient and young. He recognized her not as a memory but as a symbol, the soul of mankind itself. "You left us," she said. Her voice carried no accusation, only grief. "You promised light, but we found only fire." The emperor could not speak. The words caught in his throat, turning to ash before they left his lips. She stepped closer, the air shimmering around her. "We prayed because we were afraid," she continued. "We built your temples because we needed to believe you still heard us, but you never answered." He lowered his gaze. "I was trapped," he said. "The throne," she interrupted gently. "We were trapped with you." Her words struck deeper than any blade. He saw through her eyes the centuries of suffering, the wars fought in his name, the children born into darkness, their first breath a prayer for deliverance that never came. The emperor wanted to tell her that it had all been necessary, that without his sacrifice the species would have perished. But the truth hung heavy on his tongue. It had not been necessity. It had been pride, the need to control, to guide, to protect at any cost. He had believed himself the savior of mankind, and in doing so, he had made them small. "I thought I was giving you a future," he whispered. The woman's expression softened, and she placed her hand upon his chest. "You gave us survival," she said, "but not hope." The contact was electric. Through her touch, he felt everything. The rise and fall of civilizations, the weight of every human dream, the sorrow of those who had died, nameless in the dark. It flowed through him like fire, burning away the remnants of godhood that still clung to his essence. He saw himself reflected in her eyes, not as a deity, not even as an emperor, but as a man who had tried and failed and tried again. It was unbearable, and yet it was release. The warp around them shimmered, shifting from gold to silver, from light to shadow, as though reality itself bowed before this quiet reconciliation. The woman smiled faintly. "Do you hear them?" she asked. The emperor listened. The choir had changed. The voices were no longer weeping. They were singing. Not hymns of devotion, but songs of remembrance, stories told by those who still endured. Humanity was remembering itself. The emperor stood, and the woman began to fade, her form dissolving into starlight. "Where are you going?" he asked. She smiled, a whisper of warmth in the endless cold. "I was never meant to stay. I am what they will become." Her light scattered into 1,000 points that drifted upward, merging with the glow of distant souls. He reached out to hold her, but his hand closed on emptiness. The silence returned, softer this time, carrying with it a strange peace. He looked up and saw that the warp above him had changed. The chaos had retreated, replaced by a calm sea of dim constellations. They pulsed with faint light, fragile but real. Each one was a soul, shining not because of him, but in spite of him. He realized then that divinity had always been a distraction, a veil between creator and creation. True power was not found in immortality or faith, but in connection. The emperor took a breath that was not a breath, and the darkness around him inhaled in kind. The warp had not been conquered, but it had listened. For the first time in countless ages, it felt alive, not as enemy, but as mirror. He whispered into it, not a command, not a prayer, but a promise. "I will not be your God," he said. "I will be your witness." The words echoed, small but steady, and the warp answered with a low hum that felt like acceptance. He closed his eyes and let the quiet wash over him. Somewhere, beyond the veil of stars and sorrow, the first human dream of a new age stirred. It was faint, uncertain, but it was enough. The emperor smiled, not as a ruler, but as a man who finally understood what it meant to create and let go. The warp was never empty for long. Where silence lingered, something always rose to fill it, and in the wake of his quiet revelation, a shadow began to take form. It came not as storm or flame, but as a whisper threading through the calm, soft as breath, yet heavy as memory. The emperor felt it before he saw it, a presence older than his empire, older even than his ambition. It did not come from outside, but from within, emerging like ink bleeding through parchment. When it finally spoke, the voice was his own, only colder. "You think you have found peace," it murmured, "but peace is just the space between failures." The darkness gathered into shape, mirroring his stance, his gaze, his very soul. It was not a daemon, nor a god. It was the architect of shadows, the echo of every choice he had justified in the name of unity. The figure moved with deliberate grace, its eyes glowing faintly, neither gold nor crimson, but the color of ash. "You tried to silence me," it said. "You buried me under dreams of progress and called it vision." The emperor faced his reflection, unflinching. "You are the part I left behind," he replied. "The consequence of decisions I no longer defend." The architect smiled, and the gesture was painfully familiar. "Decisions do not vanish when regret arrives. You can no more destroy me than deny what you became." It extended a hand, and the warp shimmered with memories of conquest. Worlds burning under banners of the Aquila, legions marching in lockstep beneath suns turned red with dust. Do you see? It said softly. Every empire requires cruelty. Every god demands sacrifice. You built perfection upon the backs of those who could not carry it. I am not your enemy. I am your logic. The Emperor's light dimmed, his expression unreadable. He had seen these truths before, but never with such clarity. The architect stepped closer, its form rippling with half-remembered faces, generals, psychers, and nameless millions who had perished under his command. Their eyes blinked in unison, pleading and condemning all at once. You called it destiny, it whispered. You said humanity must be led, that ignorance must be purged. Yet every purge birthed a new faith. Every victory birthed rebellion. You cannot shape eternity with mortal hands. The Emperor turned away, the void trembling beneath his feet. I did what was necessary. The architect's voice sharpened. And who decided that necessity but you? The words echoed like thunder through the endless dark, and for the first time since his fall, the Emperor felt something close to fear. He looked down and saw the warp shifting beneath him, forming landscapes of forgotten worlds. He saw Kalth, Prospero, Istvan, Terra itself, each one flickering like an ember in the dying wind. The air smelled of burnt ozone and sorrow. He knelt and touched the ground, feeling the pulse of every life lost in his name. The architect crouched beside him, its shadow merging with his own. You thought yourself above chaos, it said, but chaos was never the enemy. It was the mirror. You feared the reflection more than the corruption. The Emperor rose, the movement weary but resolute. You speak as if morality were weakness. The shadow tilted its head. Not weakness, illusion. You believed the end justified the means because you thought the end was yours to define. That was your first sin. The Emperor closed his eyes, and the weight of 10,000 years pressed against him like gravity. He remembered the faces of his sons, their laughter before war made them myths. He saw the moment Horus hesitated before the final blow, the grief hidden beneath betrayal. He saw Magnus reaching through the warp to warn him, punished for his loyalty. The architect's voice softened, almost tender. You loved them, it said, but love became possession. You forged them in your image and cursed them when they sought to be more than reflections. The Emperor's reply was a whisper. I wanted them to be better. No, the shadow said. You wanted them to be obedient. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. The two figures stood at the center of creation's wound, bound by memory. The warp pulsed around them, alive with echoes of their conversation. The Emperor felt anger rise, but behind it came sorrow, and behind that, understanding. The shadow was not wrong. It had no malice, no deceit. It was truth without mercy, logic without soul. To destroy it would be to destroy the lessons it carried. Yet to embrace it would mean accepting that every atrocity, every sacrifice had been an extension of his will. The Emperor's light flickered again, weaker now, but steady. If I am to rule my soul, he said quietly, then I must forgive what built it. The architect paused, uncertain. Forgiveness was not a concept it understood. You cannot forgive what deserves judgment, it said. The Emperor looked into its eyes, his own reflection staring back. Forgiveness is judgment, he answered. It ends the war that reason cannot. The shadow trembled, its form unraveling like smoke in wind. For a moment, it looked almost human, weary, afraid. Then what becomes of me? It asked. You remain, he said, as memory, not master. The warp brightened, not with divine brilliance, but with a subdued glow of equilibrium. The architect's face softened, and for the first time, it smiled without cruelty. Then perhaps, it whispered, we were never enemies. The Emperor reached forward, and their hands met. The contact was silent and absolute, the merging of shadow and flame. The darkness sank into him, not as corruption, but as acknowledgement. The warp stilled, rippling outward like the breath of a sleeping god. When the light faded, the Emperor stood alone once more. He felt smaller, yet freer, as though a chain had been lifted. Around him, the void shimmered with faint colour, the first trace of dawn in a place that had never known morning. He exhaled, and the sound became wind across unseen fields. Somewhere, far away, a star reignited. The architect's final words lingered in his mind, not as warning but as remembrance. Perfection is not purity, but balance. The Emperor opened his eyes to the dim horizon and began to walk again, carrying both light and shadow as one. The warp shimmered like liquid glass as he walked through it, no longer hunted, no longer hunting, but listening. Every step sent ripples through eternity, distorting fragments of forgotten battles and fading prayers. He had merged his light with his shadow, but the balance he found was fragile, as if the act of understanding had invited something deeper to awaken. He sensed it long before he saw it, a gathering storm at the edge of his perception, an intelligence that pulsed with the rhythm of thought and time. It was vast, layered across the immaterial like continents of memory. The warp had never been empty, but now it whispered with a coherence that frightened even him. The Emperor slowed, his golden form dimmed by reflection. He realized he was no longer merely in the warp. He was inside the collective mind of mankind itself. Their fears, dreams, and buried desires swirled around him, shaping this place into a living monument of consciousness. He had thought the warp chaotic, but now he saw its order, cruel and inevitable, a mirror of human nature sculpted from emotion and consequence. He drifted past structures of thought that resembled temples carved from longing. Within them stood statues of himself, each one twisted differently by interpretation. In some he was saviour, his hands outstretched in mercy. In others he was tyrant, crowned in blood and iron. Between them lay shadows of countless other forms: saint, monster, father, betrayer. The warp preserved every version of him because humanity could not decide what truth to keep. He touched one of the statues, and it bled light. The memory within it unfolded like a wound reopening. He saw a battlefield, the siege of terror, blood and thunder and faith colliding as his sons turned their guns against one another. He felt again the weight of that final strike, the moment Horus fell, the silence that followed. He had called it victory, but here the word tasted hollow. The warp whispered through the vision, every triumph becomes its own undoing. He pulled his hand away, the memory fading into mist, and walked on. The air shimmered with echoes of human thought, a constant murmur rising and falling like the tide. He listened to it, not as God, but as witness. He heard the voice of a mother praying for her child to survive a winter storm. He heard a soldier begging forgiveness for sins he could not name. He heard a scholar whispering to the stars, seeking answers in equations that would never be complete. Every whisper formed a thread, and together they wove the tapestry of humanity's endurance. The Emperor saw then that he had never been their light. He had only been the reflection of their desire for meaning. Even his power was borrowed from their belief, their fear, their longing to be more than mortal. Without them, he was nothing but memory, an echo fading in the dark. The realization was humbling and terrifying. Ahead, the light changed. The horizon flared crimson, and from the depths of that glow rose forms that were neither human nor demon, but something in between. Entities shaped from collective guilt and reverence. They moved with impossible grace, their faces shrouded in veils of faith. The first spoke with a voice that carried the tone of sermons. "You have silenced the false sun," it said, "but the void demands new light. What will you offer?" The emperor did not answer. The second approached, its form flickering like fire caught in glass. "You tore down gods, yet mankind cannot live without them. If you will not rule, others will rise." He recognized the truth in its words. Even now, across the galaxy, prophets were born in his absence, each claiming revelation, each shaping the myth of his silence. The Imperium was remaking him again, sculpting divinity from absence. His war was not over. It could never end, because the need for gods was endless. The entities circled him like planets around a dying star. The air vibrated with psalms twisted into threats. "Become what they need," one whispered. "Return to the throne and burn brighter. Let them kneel and know peace." Another hissed, "Or fade, and let chaos inherit the void. Let the galaxy forget the name that once commanded unity." Their words were knives. Each choice was a wound. If he returned, he would perpetuate the lie. If he vanished, humanity would collapse into madness. The Emperor's silence deepened, and the warp held its breath. For a moment, he envied the stillness of death. But death, he knew, was only transformation. He closed his eyes and felt the pulse of the galaxy beyond. Millions of worlds bound by fragile hope, millions more lost to despair. He could not choose either extreme. Balance demanded a third path. He raised his hand, and the light within him gathered, not in brilliance but in restraint. The entities recoiled as if the absence of radiance wounded them. "I will not rule," he said, his voice low and absolute. "And I will not vanish. I will watch." The words resonated through the warp, calm and unyielding. "I will be memory, not commandment. I will guide without chains." The entities shuddered, their forms fragmenting into spirals of disbelief. "That is not power," one cried. "That is surrender." The Emperor's expression did not change. "It is freedom," he said, "for me and for them." The red light flickered and began to fade, leaving behind a silence softer than before. The entities dissolved into dust, their remnants scattering across the void like dying embers. The warp sighed, as though relieved. When the storm passed, the Emperor stood alone once more, but he felt no loneliness. The darkness around him pulsed gently, alive but subdued, no longer hostile. He sensed the distant hum of humanity, uncertain, imperfect, yet enduring. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope that they might survive without his hand upon them. He turned and looked toward the faint thread that tethered him to the material realm. Through it, he could see the golden throne, dim but stable, his body still bound to its dying machinery. The priests would soon notice the change in the Astronomicon, the subtle calming of the warp. They would call it miracle. They would write new scripture. He smiled faintly at the irony. Even absence would become faith again. He began to walk toward the faint thread of light, not to reclaim the throne, but to anchor his awareness. The journey stretched infinitely, though distance meant nothing here. Each step echoed like a heartbeat through the fabric of eternity. As he moved, he whispered, not to the gods, not to the warp, but to the species he had built and loved and broken. "You are the dream I could not perfect," he said, "and that is why you must endure." His words passed through the warp and into the minds of sleeping souls. forgotten before dawn, but remembered in feeling, a quiet urge to build, to survive, to seek the stars. He reached the edge of the thread and placed his hand upon it. The energy hummed, warm and fragile, the lifeline between divinity and decay. The Emperor closed his eyes, and with a final breath of will, he anchored himself not as god or ruler, but as witness eternal. The warp exhaled, and across the galaxy, the light of the Astronomicon steadied. In its pulse, the universe seemed, for one impossible moment, to rest. The Emperor stood between two worlds, tethered by the faint thread of existence that bound his spirit to the throne. Around him, the warp moved in slow spirals of light and shadow, no longer the tempest of rage and hunger it had once been. It felt like an ocean after a storm, calm on the surface yet restless beneath. The quiet unnerved him more than the chaos ever had. He was not meant for stillness. His purpose, his will, his very creation had always demanded motion, war, progress, control. Yet here, in the aftermath of revelation, there was only reflection. The silence pressed against him until he could hear the echo of his own thoughts reverberating through eternity. He wondered if this was what mortality felt like. The constant awareness of one's own fragility, the weight of choices that could never be undone. He had ruled galaxies, commanded armies, bent reality to his vision. Yet in the end, all that remained was the echo of a man asking himself whether it had been worth it. The warp shimmered with shifting colour, and through its folds he began to see visions again, not conjured by will, but offered by memory. He saw the faces of his sons once more, but they were not the icons of tragedy they had become. They were children again, laughing in the forges of their youth, unburdened by destiny. Horus, bold and bright-eyed, daring his brothers to race through the halls of their home world. Sanguinius, his wings glimmering in the artificial dawn, crafting dreams from light. Magnus, lost in the beauty of knowledge, his mind a galaxy unto itself. The Emperor watched them with an ache he had long buried. They had been his masterpiece and his undoing. He remembered the first time he called them his sons, the pride he felt, the love he refused to admit. Love was weakness, he had told himself, a luxury that gods could not afford. But now, stripped of godhood, he saw it for what it truly was, the only thing that had ever been real. He reached toward them, but the vision shifted. The laughter dissolved into screams, the warmth into flame. He saw them as they died, as they betrayed, as they begged for forgiveness. Horus falling beneath his hand, eyes wide with the terror of realization. Magnus consumed by the warp, his brilliance twisted into agony. Sanguinius broken upon the deck of a ship bathed in blood and prophecy. Each death had carved a scar in his soul, but he had never allowed himself to grieve. Duty had no room for mourning. Now, the grief came like floodwater, unstoppable, filling every corner of his being. The warp darkened around him, pulsing in sympathy. He sank to his knees and pressed his hands against the unseen ground, trembling. "I tried," he whispered into the void. "I tried to save them." The words vanished before they could echo, swallowed by the vastness of eternity. He realized then that there was no forgiveness in the warp, only understanding and the cruel mercy of truth. The darkness thickened, and from its depths rose figures wreathed in pale flame. They were his sons once more, but no longer as he remembered them. They stood as shades, their eyes unclouded by rage or regret. Horus stepped forward first, his armor cracked but his expression calm. "You never needed to save us," he said. "You only needed to see us." Magnus followed, his voice soft, echoing like wind through shattered glass. You feared what we might become, but you never feared what you already were. Sanguinius approached last, his wings folded close, his face serene. You believed yourself our creator, he said, but you were only the beginning. The sons became fathers, and the fathers became myths. You cannot carry the weight of eternity alone. The Emperor rose slowly, his gaze meeting theirs. Then why did I have to destroy you? He asked, his voice trembling with ancient exhaustion. Horus smiled, not with malice, but with a strange, sorrowful affection. Because you still believed there was something to save. The words pierced him deeper than any blade. He wanted to deny them, but he could not. The truth of their fate was bound to his own. He had created them from fragments of his will, from the same contradictions that now tore at his spirit. They had been reflections of his strength and magnifications of his flaws. Their rebellion had been inevitable. As he looked upon them now, he saw not failure, but consequence. Each of them had carried a part of him into destruction, and in doing so, they had freed the rest. The realization struck him like light breaking through a storm. Perhaps redemption was not an act but an inheritance, the passing of suffering from one generation to the next, until finally someone learned to forgive. He stepped toward them, and the air trembled with recognition. The sons bowed their heads, and for a moment, father and children stood as one, united not by obedience or faith, but by shared pain. Then, one by one, they began to fade. Their forms dissolved into particles of gold and ash, their voices lingering only as whispers in the silence. "Do not mourn us," Sanguinius said. "We were the fire that tempered you." Magnus's voice followed. "The dream continues, whether you wake or not." Horus spoke last, his tone soft and final. "You are not the emperor we fought. You are the man we hoped you might become." The warp shimmered, and they were gone, leaving only the echo of their passing. The emperor stood alone once more, but this time the solitude felt different. It was not punishment, it was acceptance. The ache of loss remained, but it no longer hollowed him. It filled him instead, a reminder that love and ruin were never separate. They were the same thread woven through every choice that mattered. He turned his gaze toward the faint horizon, where the thread of the material world still glowed. The light of the Astronomicon pulsed steadily, a fragile heartbeat holding the Imperium together. He knew that somewhere the priests still chanted his name, the armies still marched under his banner, and the people still prayed to the silent God on the throne. They would never know what he had seen here, what he had learned. Perhaps they were not meant to. The Emperor took a step forward, the warp bending around him like mist. He did not seek to return fully, nor to reign again. He sought only to be near, to watch, to protect not as a deity, but as presence unseen. As he walked, his light dimmed until it was no more than a glow against the infinite dark. The silence of the warp folded around him like a cloak, and for the first time in 10,000 years, he did not resist it. He closed his eyes, and the last thing he saw was the memory of his sons laughing beneath a sun that had not yet learned to die. The Emperor drifted through the hushed currents of the warp, his steps leaving no mark upon the shifting ground of thought and memory. The silence had changed again. It was no longer the stillness of peace, but the quiet before understanding. Every fragment of his being now resonated with the echoes of what had passed. His sons' forgiveness, the collapse of divinity, the birth of awareness. He could feel the weight of it all pressing gently upon his shoulders, not as burden, but as reminder. There was no crown here, no throne, no symbol of dominion. Only the endless hum of existence and the pulse of distant stars, faint and constant, like the beating heart of a sleeping universe. He closed his eyes, and the sound became a rhythm, a pattern that drew him onward, pulling him towards something unseen yet familiar. It was not power that called to him, nor duty, but curiosity, the oldest impulse that had ever driven him to create. As he followed the rhythm, the darkness around him began to shift into form. The warp parted like mist at dawn, revealing vast planes of light suspended in nothingness. Each one shimmered with memories too fragile to endure the gaze of gods. He recognized them as moments from humanity's collective soul, births, discoveries, kindnesses lost in the shadow of war. The sight stirred something deep within him. For all the centuries of conquest, he had forgotten how beautiful smallness could be. Empires crumbled, stars died, but the smallest act of compassion outlived both. He watched a mother shield her child from the cold, a soldier share his final rations, a dying man smile because someone held his hand. These were not grand victories, not the legacies carved in gold, but they were the quiet truths of what he had always sought to preserve. In those fragile glimpses, he saw the purpose of all his suffering, to give these moments space to exist. Yet as he stood amid those radiant echoes, a shadow moved beneath them. It was not hostile, but vast, a tide that swallowed the edges of light. He felt its presence stretch across time, connecting every sorrow ever born of his empire. The warp trembled, and within that darkness he saw them, the countless souls consumed by his design. Psychers sacrificed to sustain the beacon, innocents crushed beneath wars fought for his vision, worlds burned in his name by those who mistook order for mercy. They rose from the shadow in silence, their forms weightless and luminous, gazing at him without hatred. Their eyes held only one question: was it worth it? The Emperor could not answer. Every truth he might have offered dissolved upon his tongue. He had spoken of destiny, of unity, of the need for sacrifice, but here those words sounded like excuses. He had tried to save humanity by forcing it to become what he believed it should be. In doing so, he had taken from them the very freedom that defined their worth. The souls lingered, waiting for something he could not give. He sank to his knees, the field of light dimming around him. For the first time, the Emperor did not try to defend himself. He bowed his head and whispered into the quiet, "No, it was not worth it." The words did not echo. They simply settled into the warp, like stones falling into deep water. The silence that followed was not condemnation, but release. The figures of the dead began to fade, their light merging with the greater glow that surrounded him. In forgiving himself, he had given them peace. He looked up, and the horizon of the warp stretched endlessly before him, neither heaven nor hell, but something entirely new, a space where balance could exist without judgment. He rose slowly, feeling the fragments of his essence stabilize. The storms of emotion that had once ruled him were gone. What remained was clarity, sharp and serene. He turned his gaze toward the distant thread of the material realm, its light faint yet unwavering. Through it, he could see terror as it still was, scarred, sacred, alive. The faithful would continue to pray, the scholars to question, the soldiers to fight. The Imperium would endure, imperfect but unbroken. And perhaps, in some distant age, humanity would no longer need him at all. That thought, once unbearable, now felt like deliverance. He smiled, and the warp brightened in answer. The hum of creation swelled until it became indistinguishable from silence. The Emperor closed his eyes, allowing himself to dissolve into it, neither ruler nor prisoner, but witness eternal. Watching over the fragile beauty of the species, he had both cursed and loved beyond redemption. The warp no longer roared with the voices of madness, but whispered with the steady breath of creation, a quiet so vast it seemed infinite. The Emperor drifted through it like a fragment of fading light, his form dissolving and reforming in rhythm with the thoughts of those who still believed. Every prayer that reached him now felt different, no longer a demand, no longer a chain. They arrived as faint murmurs, born of habit more than faith, the last embers of devotion from a people who no longer knew whether their God could hear them. He listened without answering, and for the first time, that silence felt right. To speak again would be to claim ownership over what he had finally released. The Imperium belonged to them now, not to him. He had been its architect and its destroyer. Now he would be its witness. That was enough. As he drifted, the warp unfolded around him in slow, radiant layers. The colours were muted, shades of violet and gold bleeding into each other like dusk meeting dawn. Fragments of thought floated past, dreams of mortals scattered across the stars. He saw a guardsman on a nameless world clutching a broken locket as he prepared for battle, whispering his lover's name instead of a prayer. He saw a child tracing patterns in the dust of a shrine long abandoned, her laughter echoing where sermons had once thundered. He saw a dying scholar writing the words, "Truth is not light, it is warmth." These small flickers of life illuminated the darkness more than any sun he had ever commanded. They were humanity's quiet defiance against extinction, their proof that meaning could exist without divine direction. It filled him with something deeper than pride, an emotion so fragile it could only be described as grace. The quiet beauty of it was interrupted by a pulse that rippled through the fabric of the warp, low and steady, like the heartbeat of something immense awakening. The Emperor turned toward it instinctively, sensing both familiarity and danger. The pulse grew louder, shaking the calm he had fought to create. From the horizon of unreality rose a presence he had not felt since the birth of the Great Crusade, a consciousness vast enough to rival his own. It approached not as enemy or ally, but as inevitability. When it spoke, the sound carried through dimensions, filling the air with the resonance of truth. "You thought yourself free," it said, its voice deep as gravity. "But freedom is another form of control." The Emperor stood firm, though the air trembled around him. "I know what you are," he said. "You are the weight of belief itself, the dream that binds." The presence stirred, shifting between light and shadow, taking a form that mirrored his own. "I am what remains when gods forget themselves. I am the echo of worship." The realization struck him with terrible clarity. The devourer of faiths had not died when the full sun fell. It had waited, patient and invisible, feeding on the residue of reverence that still clung to the galaxy. As long as a single mortal whispered his name, it would endure. He had severed his divinity, yet in doing so, he had left behind a void that belief itself had rushed to fill. The creature smiled with his face, hollow and eternal. "You cannot unmake me," it said. "I am their need for meaning. I am the comfort they will never abandon." The Emperor stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly, not with power, but with resolve. "Then I will not destroy you," he said. "I will contain you. You are their shadow, and every light must cast one." The devourer regarded him with something almost like pity. "You cannot hold what exists in every soul," it whispered. "Even now, your name sustains me." The Emperor raised his hand, and the warp around them began to shudder, the currents folding inward until the horizon itself collapsed. "Then let me carry you," he said. "Let their faith rest where it was born." The air split with brilliance, neither holy nor infernal, and for a moment all of creation seemed to pause. The devourer lunged forward, its form breaking into rivers of molten gold that poured into him. Pain unlike any wound he had ever known tore through his being, but he did not resist. He absorbed the storm, drawing it into the hollow of his spirit where gods were buried and memories reborn. The light faded, and the warp fell silent once more. He stood alone, breathing the stillness that followed catastrophe. Within him, the devourer whispered softly, not as enemy but as echo. The burden was immense, but so was the peace that came with it. He could feel the prayers now as warmth, not weight, their energy flowing through him without distortion. They no longer sought miracles. They simply reached for connection. He smiled faintly, realizing that perhaps this had been the purpose all along. Not the perfection of humanity, but the acceptance of its imperfection. The warp pulsed once, gentle and steady, as if acknowledging the truth. The Emperor looked toward the faint thread of reality, where the light of terror flickered like a candle in an endless night, and whispered to no one, "Let them dream." Across the flickering plains of the immaterium, where thought could become fire and silence could roar like thunder, the Emperor moved with a slowness born of finality. The burden he carried was invisible, yet its weight reshaped the warp in his wake. No longer bound to the illusion of godhood, no longer fighting to bend the galaxy to a single will, he was now something quieter, an axis of memory around which all things turned. Within him, the echo of the devourer of faiths coiled like a serpent of light and shadow, still whispering, still watching. It did not fight, nor plead, but simply existed, patient and pulsing, like the last ember of a dying star. Every heartbeat of the galaxy fed it, every whispered devotion, every unspoken fear. He had taken it into himself not to destroy it, but to bear it, to hold in one soul the need for meaning, so that the others might live free of it, even if they never knew. The warp no longer recoiled from him as it once had. It no longer feared his gaze or flared with false reverence. It simply regarded him as part of itself, an old wound that had learned how to scar. As he approached the anchor point that tethered him still to the material world, he passed through rivers of time and thought that shimmered with untold dreams. He saw the black ships cutting through void space, their holds packed with terrified psychers whose screams lit corridors with psychic flame. He saw the halls of terror, shadowed and heavy with incense, where priests lit candles not out of faith but tradition. He saw custodians standing eternal vigil outside his throne room, unaware that their god was no longer absent, merely watching with a different kind of light. He saw a single astropath kneeling at the edge of sleep, weeping for reasons she could not name, as the Astronomicon pulsed one beat stronger than it had in 10,000 years. These moments reached him not as visions, but as sensations, tremors in the thread that connected his awareness to all that remained of his empire. He felt their fear, their fatigue, their hope that clung to rituals long hollowed by repetition. And still he did not intervene. That was the vow he had made, not to rule or to correct, but to witness and to remember. He drifted downward toward terror, not as a soul seeking return, but as a memory returning to its origin. The warp peeled away in strands of colourless wind, revealing at last the spectral outline of the throne, a jagged cathedral of iron and pain suspended in gold-lit shadow. He saw himself seated there, unmoving, a vessel of agony sustained by sacrifice. Around the base of the machine, cables writhed like veins, and the air shimmered with the raw toll of souls consumed to keep him burning. The Emperor looked upon his own body and felt no glory in its endurance, only sorrow. The thrown corpse was not a god, but a monument to refusal, the refusal to let go, the refusal to allow others to fall. He stepped closer and placed his hand upon the psychic echo of his form, letting the pain bleed into him. There was no need to separate soul from machine. The link was already complete. His body remained the beacon, but his will no longer fought for control. He let it pulse on its own, steady and soft, like the dying heartbeat of a man who had once tried to save everything and now only asked to remember what he loved. As his spirit merged with the rhythm of the Astronomicon, he felt the devourer coil tighter, its whisper returning. "They will always need you," it said. "They will always build you again." And this time, he did not answer with denial or defiance. He answered with stillness. The warp folded around him, the golden light dimmed to a dusky glow, and the Emperor, once the most powerful will in the galaxy, became something simpler. A guardian of dreams he could no longer shape, a witness to an empire he no longer controlled. Above terror, the stars flickered and steadied. The void grew quiet, and in the pause between breaths, the Imperium turned without knowing that its god had laid down his crown and closed his eyes, not in death, but in peace. Far beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace, in the void between stars where silence devoured thought, the light of the Astronomicon pulsed a fraction more steadily, unnoticed by those who depended on it most. Ships moved through the sea of darkness, with ancient engines groaning under the weight of forgotten wars, guided by a beacon whose strength no longer came from domination, but from surrender. The galaxy did not feel the shift in any grand proclamation. There were no signs in the heavens, no words etched in flame. Instead, the change unfolded like dew collecting on rusted iron, slow, quiet, irreversible. On a world burned hollow by generations of faith, a shrinekeeper forgot the final stanza of a prayer and chose not to correct it. On a forge moon orbiting a dead gas giant, a magos erased a subroutine in a litany that no longer served its purpose. On a hive spire lost in smog and mourning, a child dreamed of a sun that didn't exist, and in her dream, the Emperor's face was not made of gold, but of soft breath and apology. These were not rebellions, they were sighs, the first exhalations of a species that had lived too long under the weight of one man's will. The Emperor, now more thought than flame, drifted beneath these moments like a current in deep water. He felt each one, and though they came without praise or recognition, they brought him something he had never truly known: freedom from being needed. He did not seek to amplify their meaning or shape them toward an end. He let them pass through him like wind through forgotten ruins. Deep within the stone bones of the Imperial Palace, the High Lords debated in circles carved by tradition. Words were spoken, records kept, decrees issued, and none of them understood that the thing they served had changed. Their emperor still breathed, still sat, still burned with the souls of the sacrificed. But the soul that once steered that fire now moved beyond their reach, drifting through corridors of memory and starlight. He no longer sought to correct them. He had tried once to make men better. Now he let them be what they were, knowing that truth would shape them more slowly than power ever could. From time to time, a psyker would feel a tremor in the great psychic wind, a moment of silence within the usual screaming gale, and they would write it off as a blessing or a hallucination. Some would fall to their knees. Others would walk away from their altars and never return. The Emperor allowed each to choose. That was his final gift to a species he had once called his own. Not salvation, not order, but the right to decide what to do with the broken pieces of their inheritance. He wandered still, not across planets or fleets, but through the ever-shifting inner architecture of mankind's shared soul. There, within the depths of thought that most would never see, he walked along a field made of questions. They grew like reeds from the soil. What am I? Why must we suffer? What comes after? And each one shimmered with uncertainty. He had once believed it was his duty to answer them all. Now he simply watched them grow. And from time to time, a question would shed its shape and become a song, or a story, or a quiet act of kindness performed on a world he had never seen. These were the things that endured, far more than banners or doctrine. He walked among them, unseen, and each time he felt the warmth of a question left unanswered, the echo of a life lived in defiance of despair. He let it enter him like a light no cathedral could contain. In the warp-born sea of abstraction, where memory and prophecy coexisted, the Emperor passed beneath a sky of his own forgotten dreams. Stars flickered above, each one a possibility never taken, a child never born, a war never fought, a word never said. He looked up and saw himself scattered across the firmament, not as conqueror, not as martyr, but as the 1,000 versions of the man he might have been. It did not wound him. It humbled him. For every version still burned with the same contradiction, hope and fear, mercy and wrath. He realized then that no path he had taken could ever have saved them all. He could not have built a perfect imperium, because perfection was not a gift the universe gave to those who demanded it. He sat beneath that sky and let the weight of every unrealized future rest on his shoulders. It was not a punishment. It was remembrance. And in that quiet act, beneath the stars of what never was, the Emperor found what he had been searching for across 10,000 years of fire and silence. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but rest. The warp had become still around him, not in surrender, but in respect, as though it too had grown quiet to allow him space to think without intrusion. The Emperor sat alone within a chamber that did not exist, beneath a sky sculpted from memory, where stars blinked like old thoughts returning. The silence felt different now, no longer the absence of chaos, but the presence of acceptance. He had walked the infinite corridors of regret and stood in judgment of himself, and in doing so, had found the one thing he had never given to another: grace. The galaxy beyond continued its orbit of cruelty and courage, but its weight no longer clung to his shoulders. He had become less than what he was, yet more than what he had claimed to be. In shedding the illusion of control, he had become something gentler, though no less vast. He watched now, not from above, but from beside. Every flicker of mortal thought, every unspoken fear, every fleeting dream brushed past his awareness like dust over stone. He did not intervene. He had learned that silence was sometimes the highest form of care. On a world he would never visit, two lovers argued beneath a broken shrine, their voices rising, not in hate, but in hunger for understanding. On another, a dying scribe etched a line of poetry into the metal floor of a derelict station, knowing no one would ever read it. These moments passed like whispers, yet they sang louder than banners or war. They were the true empire now. He had tried once to build greatness with fire and thunder. But it was in these quiet acts that humanity showed its soul. And it was the soul, not the sword, that endured. He had long believed that order was salvation, that the species he had shaped must be guided like a blade through darkness. But now he saw that they had always been light themselves, flickering and imperfect, yet unbreakable. He thought of Malkador, whose voice still lingered at the edge of his memory, a ghost made not of sorrow, but of laughter never shared. He thought of his sons, scattered into myth, and wondered how many of them had asked for something simpler before they became symbols. He thought of the throne, the cursed seat he no longer served but still occupied, and whether those who passed beneath it ever sensed the quiet presence that watched them not as ruler, but as kin. The emperor let these thoughts rise and fall like waves, unafraid to feel what once would have shamed him. The ache of failure, the pulse of pride, the warmth of remembered hands, he did not push them away. In this chamber without form, beneath this sky without judgment, he finally allowed himself to be what he had denied in life. A man, not perfect, not pure, but willing to begin again. And perhaps that was what the galaxy needed most. Not another god, not another war, but a witness who did not turn away. He closed his eyes, and the stars above him dimmed to a soft glow. Somewhere far beyond the reach of his presence, a child looked at the night sky and smiled without knowing why. The emperor felt it, a ripple in the silence, and smiled in return. It was enough. The veil between thought and silence had thinned, and within that fragile space the emperor stood, not towering, not commanding, but still. His form pulsed with a dim internal glow, no longer the blinding brilliance of godhood, but the low, steady light of presence itself. He did not speak, for there was nothing left to declare, no decree to issue, no war to wage. Time unraveled slowly here, each moment stretching into a river of reflection, and through that river flowed the memory of what he had once believed to be truth. Unity through control, order through force, survival through sacrifice. These had been his laws, unyielding and sharp, but the sharpest blade cannot build, and the deepest wound does not forget. The warp around him no longer churned with storms or twisted faces crying for recognition. It breathed with him, patient and aware, as if the realm itself had grown tired of struggle and longed to sleep. He moved through this stillness like a shadow softened by dusk, passing unseen beneath towering structures woven from human belief. Cathedrals without walls, prayers without tongues. He paused beside one of them, feeling the pulse of longing stitched into its shape. Within it, the hope of 1 billion lives reached upward, not for miracles, but for meaning. And for the first time, he understood the difference. Humanity had never truly needed a god. They had needed someone to listen. He drifted further until the world reshaped again, no longer vast and cosmic, but intimate and small. A battlefield forgotten by history stretched beneath his feet, untouched by monuments or legends. Here, nameless soldiers had died centuries ago, not for glory, but because someone told them it mattered. The bones beneath the soil remembered. The ground ached with the weight of forgotten valor. The emperor knelt, pressing his hand to the earth, and felt the last thoughts of men who would never be remembered. Fear, love, sorrow, silence. They did not cry out for vengeance. They did not demand their lives back. They asked only that someone know they had been here. He whispered to them not as a father or a god, but as a witness, and the wind rose gently in answer. In that wind, he heard voices not of the dead, but of the living, scattered, tired, still trying. A navigator steering blind through a warp storm, refusing to abandon her passengers a librarian clutching a relic that no longer spoke, searching for purpose in its silence, a medici risking everything to save a single child in a city collapsing into rot. These were the acts that sustained humanity now. Not war, not conquest, but quiet defiance against the gravity of despair. He rose and turned toward the faint glow that marked the edge of this space, where the warp met the boundary of what could still be called real. The thread that tied him to the throne remained, unbroken but loose, like a candle's wick waiting for flame. He did not know if he would return to it fully, or if he would remain in this space forever, half light, half thought. But it no longer mattered. Whether he stood among stars or memories, he would be what they needed only in silence. He would be the shape that listened. And in that listening, perhaps, the galaxy would begin to speak not to gods, but to itself. As he moved once more into the folds of the unseen, a single phrase lingered in his mind, not written, not spoken, but understood. You were never meant to save us, only to see us. He closed his eyes, and the warp held him, not as a weapon or a prison, but as a home. The veil stirred again, not with violence, but with memory drawn too near to rest. Somewhere, far beyond the edges of stars, a ripple moved through the immaterium, carried not by demons or war, but by a voice, faint, familiar, cracked by time. The Emperor turned toward it slowly, not startled, but drawn, as if a piece of his soul had drifted free and called for its counterpart. The sound became clearer, shaped into a name he had not heard in ages, a name whispered in half a breath. Malkador. The space around him folded in silence, and from its folds stepped a figure no longer mortal, no longer dust. The old man stood as he once had in the final days before terror burned, his robes weathered by time, his staff absent, his presence untouched by decay. He looked at the Emperor with the eyes of one who had waited too long to ask a question he already knew the answer to. They did not speak at first. The air between them held a gravity heavier than words, as if the mere act of standing so near risked collapsing everything they had once built. When the silence finally broke, it came not as confrontation, but as sorrow. "You never came back," Malkador said, his voice frayed and soft. "I thought you might try." The Emperor regarded him with a weariness that reached deeper than grief. "I didn't know if I could," he answered. "I didn't know if I should." Malkador nodded, the ghost of a smile forming without bitterness. "You always feared rest more than death." The truth of it stung more than any blade. In all his centuries of design and domination, the Emperor had never learned to pause. Even now, after unmaking himself, he moved like a shadow cast by duty. Malkador stepped forward, his presence warm in the cold immaterial, and sat on a stone that had not been there a moment before. "I thought we might speak," he said, "one final time." The Emperor joined him, the two of them framed by stars and fading echoes of triumph. They spoke of things no one would ever hear. The names of forgotten soldiers, the sound of rain on the first cradle of the webway, the day the Primarch project had been more hope than hubris. Malkador laughed once, short and tired, and it made the warp brighten for a moment. "You always believed in fire," he said, "but I think the galaxy survives because someone believes in embers." The Emperor looked into that tired face and understood what had been lost. Not power, not legacy, but time. Time they had never shared outside of urgency. He reached out, his hand resting lightly against the ghost's shoulder. "You were the last friend I had," he said, "and the only one who never asked me to be a god." Malkador smiled fully this time, and his form began to unravel into gold-touched smoke. That's because I knew you weren't one. His voice faded, as his body did, leaving behind a warmth that lingered long after the light was gone. The Emperor remained still, eyes closed, as if imprinting the moment into the architecture of eternity. And when he finally stood again, he felt lighter, as though something unnamed had been returned to him. He turned back toward the heart of the warp, where the last chapter waited to be written, not by decree, but by the breath of everything he had finally learned to carry. The warp was quiet now, not empty, but settled, like a sea that had finally grown tired of its own storms. The Emperor stood at its heart, no longer a figure of fire and absolutes, but something softer, shaped by memory and all the wounds he had allowed himself to finally feel. He looked out over the currents of unreality and saw not chaos, not threat, but history, unfolded, unraveled, and returned to him piece by piece. He had fought for so long to impose meaning, to carve purpose into the face of a universe that had never asked for his hand. But now, in the end, he had found meaning in letting go, not in apathy, but in trust. He had seen the worst of what mankind could become. He had built an empire from that knowledge, but he had also seen, across the ruins and the centuries, the quiet resilience of a species that had never stopped trying to love, to learn, to remember, to forgive. He had given them everything, his blood, his sons, his silence, and still they endured, not because of him, but in spite of him. And somehow, that made it beautiful. The Astronomicon pulsed softly, still tethered to his essence, but no longer hungry. The throne did not scream. The Mechanicum did not understand what had changed. The priest kept lighting candles. The galaxy kept turning. And that was the point. The Imperium did not need to know he had changed. It did not need a revelation. It needed space to become something different, something earned. He had failed to force evolution, but perhaps, in his absence, it would grow on its own. He could feel the great wheel of time beginning to turn again, not toward war, not toward peace, but toward possibility. That was enough. He had seen the future once, long ago, a future of endless fire, of gods devouring men, of silence mistaken for divinity. But now, for the first time, he could imagine another one, a future with no gods, a future where a child's question mattered more than a crusade, a future that did not need him. His presence dimmed until even the warp no longer noticed him moving. He passed through its folds like a ghost unburdened by name, by title, by throne. He became a shadow beneath thought, a warmth at the edge of breath, a presence that asked nothing and offered only this: I see you. I do not command you. I believe in you. These words would never be written, never canonized, never remembered, but they would echo soft and strange through the subconscious of humanity, carried in lullabies, in pauses before decisions, in the tremble of a hand choosing mercy instead of hate. That was how it would last, not as a rule, not as a myth, but as a feeling, as light, so faint it could barely be seen, but always there, watching, waiting, trusting. In the deepest chamber of the palace, beneath the hum of lost names and the gold-enameled silence of ritual, the Emperor's body remained unchanged, a corpse of living fire, a machine of sorrow and breath. But somewhere behind those empty eyes, the man who had tried to save mankind with force alone had vanished into the folds of something far older and wiser than power. The man who remained did not seek worship. He did not seek victory. He simply waited. and as the stars burned overhead and the last shadows of the past faded into nothing, he became what the Imperium had never asked for but always needed, the quiet soul of a father who had finally learned how to let his children go.